My name is Muhammad Ashraf. I am Assistant Professor, Government Degree College, Joda. Here my topic is Indian Consuls Act of 1909. I have divided this topic into three sections. The first section deals with the causes of this act, the second section deals with the features of this act, and the third section deals with the general appraisal of this act. Here I would like to discuss in brief the causes of this act. This act was passed by the British Parliament. This act is known as Indian Consuls Act of 1909. This act is also known as Morly-Minto reforms. Under this act, certain concessions were granted to the Indians, but Indians were not satisfied with these concessions and they continued their demands of responsible government. As a result, within a short span of 10 years after the passing of this act, the government was forced to pass another act in 1919. Here are some of the causes of this act. The first cause of this act was the failure of the Act of 1892 to satisfy the Indians. Indian National Congress was formed in 1885 and initially its demands were the expansion of the consuls, enlargement of their powers, and the majority of elected members in these consuls. The government passed an act in 1892 and tried to give practical shape to these demands of Indian nationalists. But Indians were not demands with this act because there were certain various demerits in this act. Under this act, consuls were enlarged, but the official majority was retained. The members were given the power to ask questions, but the government was not under the force to answer such questions. Moreover, the members were not given the power to ask supplementary questions. Further, the members had no control over the budget. Budget was, after getting passed by the government, it was open for discussion, but the members had no right to vote over it. Therefore, the Indians got extremely dissatisfied with these reforms and they raised the slogans like no taxation without representation, and from 1904 onwards they started the demand of self-government. They regarded self-government as the goal of Indian nationalists. This had an impact also upon the government, and they think in terms of some reforms so that they would be able to continue their rule over India. Then another cause of this act was the sufferings of the common people. Actually, Indians were suffering since the establishment of British rule. After 1892, on the one hand, Indians were not satisfied with the Act of 1892 as Indians regarded this act as the mockery of their demands. On the other hand, there emerged various such calamities took place under which Indians suffered a lot. In 1896-97, a famine broke out. This was followed by a bubonic plague. This was once again followed by a famine in 1899, and Indians uh, had to suffer a lot. But the attitude of the British officials was not friendly towards the Indians. They did not implement the policies. Therefore, Indians were enraged. They started criticizing. They started campaign against the government. The government, instead of providing some relief to the Indians, started suppressing the Indians, started arresting them. This resulted in violence against the British as well. Such incidents forced the British government to think in terms of some reforms. Then, Lord Curzon's anti-Indian policies are also regarded as the cause responsible for this act. Lord Curzon became the Governor General of India in 1899, and he remained on that position till 1905. He was the person who had the belief that he could be able to force the Indian to establish the supremacy of the British and to accept the British rule in India. He believed in centralization and tried to centralize all the institutions. He believed that such measures would strengthen the British rule, but instead of strengthening the British rule, this strengthened Indian national movement. In 1899, he introduced Calcutta Corporation Act. Under this act, elected members, their strength was reduced and it became an official organization. This was against the wishes of the Indians. Then, against the wishes of the Indians, in 1904, Indian Universities Act was passed. Under this act, Indian universities were placed under the strict control of the government. Then, in 1904, Official Secrets Act was passed. And finally, in 1904, the most controversial measure of division of Bengal was adopted. Bengal was divided into two parts: Eastern Bengal dominated by Muslims, Western Bengal dominated by Hindus. This was divided in order to weaken the Indian nationalism. This caused great resentment among the Indians, and they stood against the British and launched a movement known as Swadeshi movement. This created fear among the official circles and forced them to think in terms of some reforms. Then, international events. On the one hand, the British were implementing their reactionary policies in India. On the other hand, at international level, certain events were taking shape which also had a lot of impact upon the Indians. In 1898, Abyssinia defeated Italy. In 1905, Japan, a small Asian country, defeated Russia, a great power at that time. This had a lot of impact upon the Indians. Then this broke the myth of European invincibility, and this made the Indian realize that if they could get united against the British, they would be able to force the British to leave India. Then, extremist propaganda. This was also a factor which forced the government to think in terms of some reforms. In Indian National Congress, there was a small section, and this came to be known as extremist section. These extremists, they did not believe in British rule, and they also did not believe in the constitutional methods of the moderates. They believed that the British rule was based on the exploitation of the Indians, and therefore the British could never be sympathetic towards the Indians, and they could never rule India in the interest of the Indians. They also believed that the policies adopted by the moderates could not force the British to provide some relief to the Indians, and they were seeing the attitude of the government since the formation of the Congress. Therefore, they believe that Swaraj or self-government was the only way where the Indian could make progress. They believed that India could make progress only when they had control over their affairs. Therefore, they believed in Swaraj, and they believed in such methods which would force not to persuade the British to grant such rights to the Indians. Therefore, they believed to adopt such measures which would paralyze the government. They believed in Swadeshi and boycott of foreign goods, government institutions, government schools, government law courts, etc. On the other hand, they believed in Swadeshi. They believed in settling the disputes through local panchayats. They believed in establishing national schools. They also believed in creating awareness through methods like melas and public meetings. Therefore, the British regarded this method a great danger to their rule. They regarded the extremists more dangerous than the moderates. Therefore, they decided to adopt such measures which would isolate the extremists and which would force or persuade the moderates to have some cooperation with the government. Therefore, they announced the bait of reforms in order to weaken, to isolate the extremists, to win away the moderates, and to weaken the Indian nationalism. Then, another cause of this act was the partition of Bengal. Bengal was divided into two parts in 1905 on the basis of religion. Eastern Bengal was dominated by Muslims, Western Bengal was dominated by Hindus. Bengal at that time was regarded as the nerve center of Indian nationalism, and the British wanted to weaken this nerve center. Therefore, keeping this aim in mind, they divided this Bengal in 1905, much against the wishes of the Indians. Therefore, Indian launched a movement against this move, and this came to be known as Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi movement was generally under the control of extremists. Therefore, the British were forced to think in terms of an alternate method. They adopted a policy known as carrot and stick policy. Their aim was to isolate the extremists from the moderates, and when the extremists were isolated, it would be easy for them to suppress them. And therefore, in 1906, they announced the fresh bait of reforms and started discussion with the moderates, isolating the extremists, and after that started suppressing them. And in this way, the Swadeshi movement also started declining after 1907 onwards. Then, another cause of this act was the revolutionary activities. After decline of Swadeshi movement, there started another trend in the Indian nationalism. This was the emergence of revolutionary activities. This also forced the government to think in terms of some reforms. Then the policy of divide and rule, which was the traditional policy followed by the British. They were following this policy since 1857. The division of the Bengal was also on the base of this policy of divide and rule. Then in 1906, Muslim League was formed with the support of the British, and its chief demand was separate representation for the Muslims in the legislative assemblies. The British government assured the Muslim League that this demand would be accepted. Therefore, in 1909, the act was passed and Muslims were given separate representation The aim behind the British was to create division among the Indians on the basis of religion, so that Indian nationalism could get weakened and they would be able to strengthen their rule over India. So these were some of the causes of the Act of 1909. In 1905, liberal government was established in Britain. Lord Morley became the Secretary of the State and Lord Minto became the Governor General of India. Lord Morley sent a message to the Governor General to prepare a proposal for reforms. In 1906, a committee was formed and it submitted its report in the same year. In 1900, after that, there started lengthy discussions between the Secretary of the State, the Governor General, and the local governments. Ultimately, in 1907, a proposal, a reform scheme was formulated. On the basis of this scheme, a bill was introduced in British Parliament in 1909. In the same year, this bill received the royal assent and came to be known as Indian Consuls Act of 1909. But still, this act could not satisfy the Indians, as most of the demands were not accepted. Therefore, they continued their demand of self-government from the British government, and within a short span of 10 years, another act known as Government of India Act 1919 was passed. Thank you.